So, Age of Ultron was a movie, wasn't it? It wasn't as groundbreaking as the first Avengers, it wasn't as dramatic and emotional as Infinity War, and it didn't have nearly as good of a payoff as Avengers Endgame. But it's a movie. People often forget that there was a time, a long time ago in 2015, where people were clamoring to see this movie as if it was going to be the first movie to break $3 billion or something. Everyone was just that excited. Now, Age of Ultron is an afterthought. Does it deserve to be one? Let's talk about it. You know the drill. Click away if you haven't seen Age of Ultron or don't care to be spoiled. You know, I remember the days falling right after Age of Ultron's release, where many critics said it was as good, if not better, than the first Avengers. And then there were those who admitted it may not have been as good as the first Avengers, but it was still a fantastic movie. And then there was a small minority who outright said it was a terrible film. It's really interesting to see how those demographics have changed today. You'd be hard-pressed to find anyone who thinks this movie comes remotely close to the first Avengers. And if I had to guess, I think the MCU fanbase is split right down the middle, half enjoying the movie and half not. Does Avengers Age of Ultron deserve the kind of hate that it's been getting in the past few years? In my eyes, no, it doesn't. But I also completely understand why it gets the kind of flack that it does, and it's actually a little more subtle than you might think. Because if you ask people what they really hate about Age of Ultron, I think you'll find many can't really pinpoint a specific aspect of the film. So let me present you with two reasons as to why I think Age of Ultron didn't live up to the hype. The first is because it's Avengers Lite. Remember when video games used to have a Lite version that was free while the real one cost money and would have all the better features? Age of Ultron is just a carbon copy of the Avengers except watered down. And if you think it's only one or two little things that are similar between them, think again. Let me list a few aspects that Joss Whedon ripped right out of the first film and tried to replicate for the second. For one, the dialogue. Now, I know this isn't so much an Age of Ultron thing as it is a Joss Whedon thing, as all of his films have a distinct tone and style of dialogue. And again, as I mentioned in my review of The Avengers, I didn't like it so much then, and I don't like it so much here either. There are a few great lines in there, just like in the first Avengers, and a number of them were given to Ultron, who we'll get to later. But for the most part, the lines are just a little too much for my liking, a little too over the top and too campy. For another, let's look at the general structure of the movie. You have the Avengers, who are, granted, brought together much more quickly than in the first film, but when they are assembled, they meet a villain in a dramatic entrance. He says he wants to destroy the world. They have to chase after him. One of the members gets captured or compromised. The Hulk freaks out. They fight each other, and then they all band together again to fight him in the end. And then there's the Tony Cap argument scene, which is basically modeled after the one in the first Avengers. And then there's Hulk cutting off the villain mid-sentence and throwing him into the air for comedic effect. And then there's the final fight, which is literally the exact same thing from the first Avengers, minus the portal. But it's replaced by this weird vibranium meteor thing. Whedon even tries to outdo the circle shot that became so iconic from the first film, and he tries so hard that he ends up making this sort of discombobulated slow motion mess of a scene, where you can barely tell what the Avengers are doing, and in the end they're basically just beating up a giant faceless robot army for 10 minutes. This film, in essence, is Whedon trying to take the genius that he struck with the first film and replicate it for the second with less success. Does that make this a bad movie? Absolutely not. A watered-down version of the Avengers is much better than a lot of other movies can do, by a long shot. It's not original anymore, and it lost a little bit of that magic, but I still maintain this is a good film nonetheless. So let's say that half of Age of Ultron is trying to replicate the first Avengers. The second reason why Age of Ultron falls flat is because in another quarter of the scenes, it's too preoccupied with setting up the future of the MCU. This is a problem that a lot of people have pointed out over the years, but it's worth bringing up because it really does weigh down on the film at certain points. Everyone points to the Thor cave scene, and rightfully so in my opinion, because it's really out of place. I was enjoying the story for the most part up until then. It was making sense, it was fun, it was entertaining, it seemed to line up pretty well, and then Thor just randomly has this vision and decides to leave the Avengers and go off to a magical cave with Eric Selvig, where we see yet another trailer for Infinity War like we did in Guardians. I don't have a problem with the scene being in the movie itself, I have a problem with the reason why it's there. There are better, seamless, more natural ways to set up later MCU films, like in Iron Man 2 when they're discussing Coulson going to New Mexico, which is a reference to Thor, because that makes sense in the context of the MCU. It's clear to me that the Thor cave scene was really not for the benefit of the story of Age of Ultron. Some may argue that, oh, well, he was getting the vision and then he used that to create actual vision, but even that was really confusing to me. How did he know to strike the cradle with lightning when he got back to Avengers Tower? At best, he knew vaguely that the Mind Stone was an Infinity Stone, so why on earth would he think zapping it with lightning was going to help anything? He had no idea about vision at that point. The story really does derail towards the end of the second act, which really impacts this movie. On top of the Thor scene, Whedon had to lay the groundwork for Civil War, as well as Hulk go off somewhere unknown and have Thor leave Earth, and then also set up the new Avengers, and also Ulysses Claw. No wonder this movie broke him. Now, again, let me reiterate, do all of these things make Age of Ultron a bad movie? In my eyes, no, absolutely not. While what we do get is a clear attempt to recreate a triumph that was really not supposed to be carbon copied and really shouldn't have been, what we have in Age of Ultron is a good film that has a lot of merit on its own. Let's talk about the villain, as I enjoy doing in the beginning of my reviews. Most people are mixed on Ultron, but I happen to be one of those people who unabashedly love this character, save for one line, which we'll get to a little bit later. First of all, James Spader's voice and performance is absolutely magnetic. I think out of all the MCU villains, this is one of the best cast. You could have that guy reading the grocery list and you'd be mesmerized. He was just the perfect voice for the role, and he makes this robot so much more charismatic than he had any right being. And secondly, I do think that Ultron as a character has a really, really underrated backstory and motivation. The scene where he's going through all the data when he first meets Jarvis and he wakes up is a really, really loaded scene. He's processing all this information and he understands that Tony Stark, who created him, wants peace in our time. But he's also looking through all the other data and simultaneously comes to an erroneous conclusion that in order to do so, he needs to destroy all the human life. And I mean, technically if there are no humans from his point of view, there is no problem. At least according to this psychopathic robot. It makes sense that he, having no strings attached to anyone, no pun intended, as he tells the Avengers, would see this as the clear and obvious reason to peace as being total annihilation of the planet. He's not unlike Thanos in that regard, actually. The one line that's always bothered me, though, whenever I see this movie, and should have been cut out, is when he's confronting the Avengers, and he says, "I'm glad you asked because I'd like to take this time to tell you my evil plan." If that one line had been cut, it would have been so much better for his character. I understand that Whedon was trying to poke fun at villain monologuing and all that, but a truly layered, nuanced, three-dimensional villain who believes what they're doing is right, which Ultron seems to do, would never in 1,000 years consider themselves to be evil. You think Thanos, for all of his misgivings, ever thought he was evil? Of course he didn't. He thought he was right, and that's what makes him truly dangerous. But aside from that, I find Ultron to be an incredibly charismatic villain to watch on screen, and I think he's easily one of the strongest characters in the film. Speaking of new characters, let's talk about Scarlet Witch and Quicksilver. Man, Scarlet Witch has come a long way in the MCU because I really didn't find her character that likable in this movie, and the same goes for Quicksilver. I do think that we would have quickly warmed up to Aaron Taylor Johnson's Quicksilver as we have with Wanda Maximoff, but in regards to this movie, pretty average to me. His death, in terms of the context of the movie and his relationship with Hawkeye, was, yes, moving, but we just didn't spend enough time with the character to really care about him that much. And then there's Vision. So, yes, while I think the introduction and the way we get to Vision is very roundabout and extremely wonky, I think Whedon nailed this character. He's like Ultron without any of the flaws, and you can clearly see that this was the kind of android that Tony was thinking about when he first imagined Ultron. I love that they just used Paul Bettany, now in physical form, because he's so great in the role. And the scene where he lifts Thor's hammer may be one of the best scenes in the entire MCU, both just from a fan perspective as well as a story perspective. What better way to prove to the Avengers, most of whom believe that this creature is extremely hostile, that he's worthy of their approval, than to pick up the hammer? It was a golden move from Joss Whedon, and it was foreshadowed so brilliantly earlier on in the film in the party scene, and was easily one of the best parts of this movie. Aside from that, everything else is relatively fine. Tony is the usual Tony, which, yes, is strange to see after Iron Man 3, but what can you do? You know, contracts and all. And while Tony is still facing his PTSD and his visions about the future, he does revert back to normal Tony towards the end, and he really disregards that part of his arc, so there's that. And yes, we are all grateful that Steve Rogers got a better costume in this movie, because can you actually imagine that they used this costume at all in a big budget movie? As far as the Bruce-Natasha romance is concerned, I don't really have that big of an opinion on it. Was it great? No, not really, and to be honest, do I wish that it was taken out of the movie? Yeah, kind of. But is it the worst thing in the world? No, certainly not, and I think it functions fine as a one-off sort of thing, although I am glad that they never pursued it any further in the MCU. The one thing that did stick out like a sore thumb for me was this theme of being a monster. I understand exactly what Whedon was trying to do, and to his credit, I give him props for trying to put a theme and a sort of lesson in this blockbuster film, but I guess subtlety has had its day because he just ends up hammering the theme of being different being a good thing over and over and over and over again. Seriously, the amount of times these characters say, "We're monsters, I'm a monster, we're monsters," it's crazy. It's not just Bruce either. Black Widow says it, Tony says it, Bruce says it, and they're all basically trying to say the same thing. which is it's okay to be different. Again, I applaud Whedon for the concept, and it had the potential to work, with the Avengers creating an actual monster in Ultron and having to wrestle with the idea of whether or not they themselves are the monsters for creating him. But even in recording this video and me having to say monster over and over, I'm just getting sick of it. In the end, Age of Ultron is not a bad movie by any stretch of the imagination. However, it is a sloppier version of the first Avengers, and sometimes it's very clear that Whedon was so desperately trying to use the formula that worked so well in the first movie and do it again, which didn't work out so well this time around. The new characters are interesting, the villain is great, in my opinion, and overall, Age of Ultron is just 2 hours of fun with the Avengers characters. It definitely won't have an emotional toll on you or anything, but it's not a regrettably bad 2 hours. I mean, come on. 2 hours with the Avengers doing anything, that's probably going to be a fun time. I'll give Avengers Age of Ultron a B- and a 7.5 out of 10.
Fine. I'll do it myself.
One eternity later.
There are 2 more stones on Earth. Find them, my children, and bring them to me on Titan.
What did you think about Avengers Age of Ultron? Comment down below and let me know. Make sure to subscribe and hit the like button to support the channel, and if you'd like to check out more content, then click on the videos on the screen right now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.